Whether it's TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram or some other app, a lot of American kids are using social media. A Pew Research survey shows 95% of 13 to 17-year-olds use it. A third of them admit to being on social media constantly, prompting the Surgeon General to warn in a new report it's posing a profound risk of harm. Dr. Vivek Murthy says social media is a main contributor to depression, anxiety, suicide, and loneliness. He'll get no argument from Utah Governor Spencer Cox.
Ask teenagers. This is one of my favorite things to do. I ask them, are you seeing an increase in your own life, amongst your friends, in your school, in depression, anxiety, and self-harm? And every one of them will say yes.
Governor Cox told NBC's Meet the Press back on March 26th.
And then I ask the question, what do you think is causing it? And every one of them tell me it's social media.
That was after Cox, a Republican, signed a new law in Utah, putting age restrictions and other regulations in place for social media companies there, trying to limit the danger children are holding in their hands.
You know, we're getting these things for our kids, kind of crossing our fingers, rolling the dice, and now we're seeing the outcomes.
Tom Kirsting is a screen time expert, a licensed psychotherapist in New Jersey with a new book, Raising Healthy Teenagers.
You know, the anxiety disorders, the depression, the increasing suicide, the body dysmorphia, and all these other things that are taking place. And I call these phones, I refer to them as the modern day weapons of mass destruction.
The Surgeon General says this is the defining public health issue of our time, mental health for our kids. Do you agree?
100%. I mean, you just look at the data. Look at it like this, right? So kids are spending between 8 and 9 hours a day in total screen time, okay? Think about that. That's more than any life activity, including school and sleep. So they're essentially sort of checked out of the real world for the majority of their life, and they're hypnotized in the cyber world. And how can we expect, you know, kids to function in a mental well way, in an emotionally well way, if they're not living essentially as human beings on planet Earth and they're somewhere else? Let's think about that.
How does using social media affect the brain and the brain's development for a child? I know it can obviously lead to addiction for adults too, but what does it do to the brain of a child?
Basically what it is the human brain is called neuroplasticity. All right. So any human being that is engaged in anything considered highly stimulating for 3 or more hours a day, what's going to happen is the brain is going to grow new neural pathways and assimilate to that environment and potentially prune away pathways that are being underutilized. And we know our kids are spending not 3 hours a day, close to 9 hours a day in the most highly stimulating world. So it's triggering, you know, attentional issues, lack of focus and so forth when a kid is sitting in a classroom because they're so used to the stimulation. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of kids are being diagnosed with ADHD that likely don't even have it. So that's part one. Another thing, you know, how these things, the social media apps and games are designed to target the pleasure-seeking part of the brain that produces dopamine. So our kids are getting this never-ending dopamine drip all day long, right? Which is the feel-good chemical, and it's tied to every addiction. You know, as a result, what I've been seeing professionally the last few years is a major increase in oppositional defiant disorder, which is kids that are just disrespectful, cursing at their parents and so forth. And it's consistent with if you take a drug away from a drug addict, they're going to freak out. They're going to withdraw. They're going to crash. You take the device or the stimuli away from the child, they're going to withdraw. They're going to crash, and it's going to manifest itself behaviorally.
So what should a parent do? How do we manage this better? When you get to middle school, when you get to 9th grade and 10th grade, this is how kids are interacting with each other. And if your child doesn't do that, aren't they going to feel left out?
Well, that's the double-edged sword. So that's where a lot of parents are kind of just, I guess, giving in and, like I said, crossing their fingers and rolling the dice. You know, they feel like, all right, if my kid doesn't have the phone, you know, and all the social media, he or she is going to be left out and not feel included. Now, we don't know that that's a fact just yet. You know, kids in that age, just by nature, because they're in, you know, adolescence, puberty and so forth, are just naturally insecure. You know, this is just another layering effect, right? So for any parents listening right now, if your kids already have these devices, there's a couple things that you need to do right now. And I'm telling you this based on my professional experience. I deal with a lot of teenagers and middle schoolers. Almost every one of them is allowed to have their phones in their bedrooms with them at night, overnight in their bedroom, right? And I did my own survey a few years ago, Dave, when I was working at a public high school.
Yeah.
I collected data from about 100 kids, and I asked them this question. I said, and they were all honest with me. I said, what time do you go to sleep on school nights? And 90 something out of those 100 kids told me they went to sleep between 1 and 4 a.m. and that their parents had no idea. And that's because the phone's in the bedroom.
1 to 4 in the morning?
That's correct. That's correct. Just that alone is going to trigger a substantial mental health crisis, because an exhausted, tired, grouchy kid cannot function, cannot excel in school, and is going to fall behind, and they're going to get accustomed to this tired, unpleasant mood, and it's really just like the perfect storm. Now you layer everything else on top of that, now we have like the ultimate storm.
So what about social media causes depression or anxiety?
Well, a lot of it is, so you take a kid an adolescent, right, who, the biggest thing with being a preteen or teen is you're kind of trying to figure out where you fit in the social pecking order, right? And now you get a social media app, right? And all of a sudden you're getting all of this feedback, all of this attention, all these streaks, all these likes and so forth. None of that is genuine or real. So when you look at the term self-esteem, the important word there is the word self. It can only come from within. So happiness, confidence, and motivation can never come from the outside and only the inside out. That superficial stuff is actually stunting their self-esteem. And because they're on it all the time, they never get to actually know who they are.
Before kids are actually on social media directly interacting with other kids and others, they may be on YouTube and other channels just watching videos constantly, like TikTok, without actually interacting with anybody, but just watching videos all the time. What's that? And how does that affect them?
Yeah, so the issue there is the algorithms, right? So TikTok and YouTube, perfect example right there. When you do a search for anything, right? Those algorithms gather, billions of videos and like narrow down videos that it now knows that you like. And then you just continue to get bombarded with the next video, the next video, the next video. And it's like, getting sucked down this deep, dark rabbit hole. And that's something I really think, legislatively they need to do, something about these algorithms. And, you hear the stories about, all these girls on TikTok developing eating disorders and body dysmorphia because their brains are just being bombarded with this stuff. And that's the way the brain works. The more you're exposed to something, the more it normalizes it and the more it actualizes it.
So what kind of regulation would you advocate? I mean, a lot of people are wary of the government getting involved in doing too much with our kids. It's like when we talk about education, a lot of parents are like, it's my right, not your right, when it comes to what my child should learn.
Yeah, and I agree to that extent. We don't want too much government oversight controlling our lives. I totally agree with that. But would we let our kids just start smoking cigarettes when they're 13, 14, and 15? We have laws for that, right? And I think this is worse. When you look at the suicide rate, when you look at the sense of hopelessness that kids have, that means that we parents are not doing a good job. Okay. And I know there's a social conformity and all that stuff. I think most parents, if there was a law, it would take the burden off the parents' shoulders, because the parents, the reason why they're handing these things to their kids is because of the blowback that they're getting from their kids and, and the feeling of, them being left out and so forth.
Now, obviously, a parent, if you give your child a phone, you can put parental controls on that phone. You can put limits, right, on screen time. What do you recommend?
Yeah, there are apps. A good one is Net Nanny, and you could put restrictions, time limits. You could block, certain keywords. Let's say, for example, like, violence or murder or pornography or something, so that you block those keywords and your child's phone will not be able to, be redirected towards any websites that have any of that content. That's a good starting point. And I think another important tip is that we parents need to practice what we preach. And that means when we are at home with our own children, we need to lead by example. And that means putting down our own devices, spending time together as a family, reintroducing family dinner. All those things are so very critically important for our children's overall well-being and mental health.
There are those who point out that social media is not all bad here. We're talking about it in this horrible, negative way, but it does allow people to connect with people who are like themselves. It might help people who are in a certain, let's say they're LGBTQ. They can connect with people who have like situations that they can relate to better. I mean, that's some of the arguments. That's not all social media is bad.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, when I'm doing my lectures, I start off by saying, listen, technology is not in and of itself a bad thing, right? Technology is a great thing. There's a lot of things we can do with it. It's kind of like, here's a perfect analogy. A glass of wine with dinner isn't necessarily a bad thing. 9 glasses of wine with dinner 7 nights a week is a bad thing. that's where we're at. It's not just the social media itself. It's the amount of time that these kids are spending on social media and other screen time content.
What should social media companies do?
Some of them say they have an age restriction, but there's really no way of monitoring it. So I think what they should do is come up with a way in which, let's say the age is 16 years old. If they say, all right, no kids, I think it's 13 now, but let's say, all right, fine, we're going to make it so that no kids under 16 are allowed on here. But create, a way in which it makes it impossible for that kid who's 16. I don't know if you use facial recognition or whatever it is, but actually make it so that it's not possible for kids, just using that as an example, age 16, to not be able to get on there. And I think they really need to analyze these algorithms and do something about that. I mean, because it's just, it just takes these kids at the most vulnerable age, developmentally, it just takes them down this very deep, dark path in many instances.
So what will it mean if nothing really changes 20 years from now? What do you see for our future if we allow social media to be what it is today and continue to be the same?
What I worry about down the road is that because our children are living in a completely different habitat, they're living in the cyber world, right? And not as much in the real world. What's going to happen when they now necessarily have to start existing in the real world? How will they have developed, the skills that are necessary to excel in the real world? The social skills, the interaction skills, the coping skills, and so forth. So I do worry that, down the road, this generation is going to be, I hope I'm wrong, but like not as functional as previous generations.
Tom Kirsting, licensed psychotherapist, expert on screen time and mental health, also the author of the new book, Raising Healthy Teenagers. Tom, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.